The water was shallow, barely deep enough to cover her face. Yet that's where they found her, floating near the bank of Ontario's Severn River, her wedding pajamas drifting softly with the current. The year was 1947. The bride, Christina Kettlewell, had been married just 8 days. Only a short distance away, the cottage where she and her new husband were staying lay in ruins, reduced to ash by a fire no one could explain. In the stillness that followed, questions spread faster than the flames ever had. Why had the blaze started? Why had the young couple brought a third person with them on their honeymoon? And how did a vibrant 22-year-old woman end up lifeless in less than a foot of water? Police arrived to find a scene that made little sense. There were no signs of struggle, no obvious cause of death, and no clear story that fit. Within days, newspapers across Canada were calling her the 8-day bride. What began as a quiet elopement had turned into a national obsession, a tangle of secrecy, money, and relationships that investigators struggled to decipher. 78 years later, the mystery still lingers. Every theory sounds plausible until it isn't, and every clue seems to point in 2 directions at once. Welcome to Bad Things. Join us as we retrace the final 8 days of Christina Kettlewell's life, examine the evidence that confounded police, and search, through fact, rumor, and everything in between, for what most likely happened. Do you want to bring bad things with you wherever you go? Our episodes are now available as a podcast. Look us up on your favorite podcast app and listen to the most truth-seeking true crime podcast out there. Christina Mocken grew up in Mimico, a small lakeside community west of Toronto. The daughter of Polish immigrants, she was known as polite and reserved, a steady young woman who worked as a clerk in a local bank. In 1944, when she was 19, she met John Jack Kettlewell, a 26-year-old Canadian war veteran recently returned from overseas. He was charming, confident, and older, qualities that drew Christina in quickly. Their courtship lasted 3 years. But from the beginning, there was a third figure hovering close by. Ronald "Ronnie" Barry, Jack's best friend. Barry was a 28-year-old former ballroom dancer and insurance salesman, well-dressed and sociable. He spent a great deal of time with the couple, enough that Christina's family noticed. Her father, strict and religious, was uneasy about both men, partly because Jack was not Catholic, and partly because Ronald always seemed to be in the background, a constant presence that no one could quite explain. Jack eventually converted to Catholicism to calm the Mocken family's concerns. It helped little. In the spring of 1947, Christina vanished from home for 2 weeks. When she returned, she said nothing about where she had been. Then, on May 12th, she and Jack quietly eloped. The ceremony was small and secret, attended by only a few friends, including Barry. Christina's family learned afterward that their daughter was married and that she and Jack were leaving town. The newlyweds' first stop was a Toronto apartment on Tyndall Avenue, rented under Barry's name. The friend was living there too. For several days, the three shared that apartment before driving north towards Seven Falls, a remote area of cottage country about 40 kilometers above Orillia. The place was accessible mainly by boat. Barry owned a small cabin along the Severn River that he offered for the couple's honeymoon. It was secluded, surrounded by forest and water, and reached only by crossing the river in a motorboat. Witnesses later said Christina seemed unsettled during those days. Her mood shifted sharply between anxiety and withdrawal. She cried without clear reason, then appeared calm and detached. Barry would later tell investigators that she confided private fears to him, that she was uncertain whether Jack truly loved her, and that she was overwhelmed by the pressure of the marriage. Jack, according to his own statement, noticed little beyond her nervousness. Unknown to him, Christina had been struggling with her mental health for weeks. 5 weeks before the wedding on April 6, 1947, she had fallen ill on Easter Sunday. At the time, Jack believed it was a passing sickness. After her death, police recovered letters showing that Christina had, in fact, attempted to poison herself that day. The letters were written to Barry, expressing despair over Jack's hesitance to propose. In one note she wrote that this was the best way out, and that she could not bear to see another girl have him. A handwriting expert later confirmed the letters were genuine. A second note, written later that month, described another attempt, this time directed at both herself and Jack. "When you love someone, you really love him," she wrote, "and if I cannot have him, I do not intend anyone else to." The letters were never shown to Jack before the wedding. Barry kept them. On May 17th, the three arrived at the cottage. It was a simple wooden structure, one main room with a stove, a small kitchen and a sleeping area. Nearby was a shallow backwater that fed into the Severn River. For 2 days, the group fished, cooked, and spent time outdoors. Locals later reported hearing nothing unusual. No arguments, no disturbances. The night of May 19th, Christina wrote what would be her final letter. She addressed it to Mrs. Thomas, a Toronto landlady who had once rented to the couple. She handed the envelope to Barry, asking him to mail it. In the letter, she mentioned that Ronnie is in the boat outside somewhere, and added, by the time he gets back, everything will be all over with. The words would later be read aloud at the inquest. On the morning of May 20th, 1947, the routine appeared ordinary. Jack and Christina stayed at the cabin while Barry took the boat out. Exactly what happened afterward is not fully known. Around midday, smoke began rising from the direction of the cottage. The fire spread quickly, consuming the wooden structure in less than an hour. Neighbors along the river noticed a column of smoke and moved toward the area. One of them, Major Lawrence Scardfield, ran to the shoreline to fetch water to fight the flames. He said later that he saw no one near the river at that time. Barry returned by boat to find his cottage ablaze. According to his statement, he found Jack inside, semi-conscious and bleeding from a head wound. He pulled him out through a window and dragged him to safety. Jack was alive but dazed, with burns on his arms and face and what appeared to be the effects of a drug or sedative. He would later tell police that he remembered nothing after 11 a.m. that morning. Barry placed Jack in the boat and set out for the village to find help. Along the way, he alerted nearby residents and phoned police. Jack was taken to hospital in Orillia, where doctors treated him for shock, burns, and a concussion. Tests suggested he had codeine or a similar compound in his system. That evening, when the ruins of the cottage had cooled, a local boathouse owner named Neville Sweet noticed something floating near the edge of the water, about 150 feet from the burned foundation. It was the body of Christina Kettlewell. She was lying face down in a shallow pool off the riverbank. The water was no more than 9 inches deep. The autopsy later confirmed that she had drowned. Her lungs contained water, but her body showed no sign of external injury or burn. Chemical analysis found codeine in her stomach, though not in a fatal dose. There was no soot in her airways, indicating she had not inhaled smoke from the fire. The time of death could not be precisely fixed, but the evidence suggested she had died sometime during or shortly after the blaze. The discovery set off a full-scale investigation. Police questioned both surviving men extensively. Jack, recovering from his injuries, could recall little beyond fragments of that morning. Barry was interrogated for more than 13 hours and produced a detailed written statement exceeding 3,000 words. Investigators described parts of his account as fantastic, meaning implausible or exaggerated. Still, they found nothing that conclusively proved foul play. On June 19, 1947, a coroner's inquest opened in Bracebridge. Crowds filled the small courtroom and nearby hallways, drawn by headlines dubbing the case "The Mystery of the Eight-Day Bride." Proceedings were led by Crown Counsel C.P. Hope, who quickly focused on Barry's actions and finances. Hope openly accused him of lying and hinted that his role was sinister and unexplained. Evidence presented revealed a tangle of insurance policies. Before the wedding, Jack had purchased two $5,000 policies, one on his own life and one on Christina's, both naming Barry as beneficiary. Each policy carried a double indemnity clause that would double the payout in the event of accidental death. Barry, in turn, insured his cottage for $5,000 and named Jack as the beneficiary. The arrangement puzzled investigators and the public alike. Under questioning, Jack offered little clarification. He said Barry had handled the paperwork and that he had trusted him implicitly. It also emerged that Jack had recently given Barry his wartime gratuity payment and altered his will to remove family members. These financial connections intensified suspicion, but provided no direct link to Christina's death. Midway through the inquest, Crown Counsel Hope read aloud a statement Jack had given police, in which he admitted that he and Barry had been in an intimate relationship for several years. In court, Jack initially denied saying this, claiming the police had coerced him. When pressed repeatedly, he conceded the possibility, acknowledging that he and Barry were very close. The revelation stunned the courtroom. In 1947, such a relationship was not only taboo, but criminal under Canadian law. Over several weeks, witnesses recounted details of the couple's final days. Christina's erratic moods, the secrecy surrounding the elopement, the letters preserved from the fire, and Barry's account of the blaze. Each testimony seemed to complicate the story further. In the end, the coroner's jury returned an open verdict. They declared that Christina Kettlewell had drowned and that traces of codeine were present, but they could not determine how or why. The foreman stated that, owing to the suspicious circumstances of the death, we cannot say whether it was accidental or otherwise. No criminal charges were filed. After the inquest, Jack Kettlewell faded quietly from public life. He later remarried and had a son. Ronald Barry left Canada in the 1950s, reportedly moving to New York and eventually dying in Florida decades later. Christina's family remained in Ontario, maintaining that nothing about her death ever made sense. To this day, the official record ends there. A burned cottage, an unconscious groom, a drowned bride, and a friend whose role was never fully explained. When the inquest closed in 1947, officialdom left the 8-day bride case suspended between accident and intention. Yet that silence invited others to fill the void. Over the decades, journalists, criminologists, and amateur sleuths have proposed explanations that range from methodical homicide to tragic self-destruction. Each theory attempts to account for the same small set of facts: a remote cabin, a sudden fire, a drug in the bloodstream, and a young woman drowned in water barely deep enough to bathe a child. But how those pieces fit together has never been agreed upon. Number 1. The conspiracy of two. The most enduring suspicion, and the one whispered almost immediately after the discovery, was that Jack Kettlewell and Ronald Barry had plotted Christina's death together. Supporters of this idea pointed to the web of insurance policies linking the men, policies on both Jack and Christina naming Barry as beneficiary, and another policy on Barry's cottage naming Jack. To some investigators, this triangular arrangement looked less like friendship and more like a business plan. "Why?" asked Crown Counsel C.P. Hope during the inquest. "Should a man on his honeymoon place his friend in control of his wife's life and death benefit?" His question echoed in courtrooms and newspaper columns alike. According to this theory, Jack and Barry were partners in a carefully timed fraud. The plan, as it's imagined, was to drug Christina, ignite the cottage, and leave behind a scene that appeared to be an accidental drowning. The double indemnity clause would ensure a larger payout. Barry's later decision to rescue Jack from the fire could then be seen as a miscalculation, the scheme gone slightly awry when one victim survived. The argument gains weight from circumstance. Barry was in debt, his small businesses failing, and insurance was the one field he knew well. Those who believe in the conspiracy note that he somehow rescued a bundle of personal letters from the burning cabin. Letters that established Christina's prior mental instability, while claiming to have lost everything else. The timing, they say, was too convenient. Yet the theory falters where evidence should begin. There was no proof that either man ever collected insurance money, and forensic work of the day found no sign that Christina had been physically restrained or attacked. Her body bore none of the marks typical of violence. To accept this version is to accept that two men staged a flawless crime with no forensic trace, an act of cunning unsupported by anything beyond suspicion. Number 2. The friend turned foe. A second interpretation isolates Ronnie Barry as the single architect of the tragedy. In this retelling, Jack is portrayed not as a conspirator, but as an unwitting participant, a man who trusted the wrong friend. Barry's behavior fed such speculation. He had inserted himself into every corner of the couple's relationship, arranging the honeymoon, controlling the finances, and traveling everywhere with them. Even Christina's sister, Helen Mocken, later said, "We thought it very strange that Ronnie went along. It made us wonder if he was also in love with Chris." If Barry's affection had indeed shifted from friendship to obsession, jealousy could have been motive enough. Perhaps, say proponents, he planned to remove both husband and wife in one staged catastrophe, the fire. In that light, his frantic rescue of Jack might have been an improvisation after the plan partially failed. This version of events aligns with the remark by prosecutor Hope, who described Barry as a liar of the most blatant kind, whose sinister figure permeates the whole of this tragedy. Hope never charged him, but made no secret of his distrust. Still, the lone villain theory struggles with the same missing proof. Barry's supposed motives, jealousy, money, control, remain speculative, and no one ever demonstrated how he could have drugged both victims without detection. Forensic testing of the day was primitive. Even so, investigators found no trace of force or external injury. To many, the theory feels narratively satisfying, but evidentially hollow. Number 3. The emotional explosion. A more human, less calculated explanation sees no mastermind at all. Only 3 people caught in a volatile triangle of affection and insecurity. In this interpretation, Christina's death was not murder, but the outcome of a relationship collapsing in on itself. According to inquest testimony, Christina's moods at the cottage swung from tearful to withdrawn. She had already written that she could not live without Jack, and hinted she might take him with me if she had to. Supporters of this scenario believe something happened inside the cabin that morning, an argument or revelation that triggered a desperate chain of events. Perhaps Christina learned of an intimacy between Jack and Barry, or confronted one or both men about it. The head wound Jack suffered could suggest a physical altercation. The codeine in his system, a sedative taken or administered in panic. The fire might then have been Christina's rash attempt to destroy herself and everything around her. In this reading, Barry's role becomes reactive rather than premeditated. He stumbles into disaster, rescues his friend, and returns to find the bride gone. This theory accounts for the lack of clear planning or profit. It also fits the tone of Christina's final note. By the time he gets back, everything will be all over with. This line reads more like a farewell than a threat. Still, because it depends on private emotion, it remains impossible to verify. There were no eyewitnesses inside that cottage in its final minutes, and the only survivor claimed to remember nothing after mid-morning. Number 4. The simple, awful possibility. There is finally the explanation most investigators quietly leaned toward once the noise faded: that Christina's death was a solitary act, not a conspiracy. Her letters, verified by experts, outline a pattern of despair that predated the marriage. She had attempted self-harm weeks before the elopement, spoken of poisoning, and described her love for Jack in possessive, fatalistic terms. Her last known words to a friend predicted an ending once Barry came back. Under this lens, the fire, the poison, and the drowning might all belong to one person's tragic plan. Christina could have drugged herself and her husband, set the blaze, and then walked to the river as the house burned behind her. Critics of this idea argue that the method seems implausibly complex. Poison, fire, and water in sequence, and that it ignores the suspicious financial links around her. Yet it is also the only scenario directly supported by her own writings. At the inquest, when the jury returned its open verdict, one member was heard to remark that there was too much codeine for accident and too little for murder. That single sentence captures why this theory persists. It requires no villain, only a woman overwhelmed by her circumstances. When every rumor is stripped away, the 8-day bride mystery leaves just a handful of certainties. A fire that shouldn't have started, a young woman found in calm water, and no proof that anyone else laid a hand on her. The simplest explanation, and the one that fits the evidence with the fewest leaps of imagination, is that Christina Kettlewell's death was the result of her own emotional crisis, not a calculated crime. Christina's private letters tell us more than any testimony could. They weren't dramatic confessions written for attention. They were steady, deliberate messages, showing a mind caught between devotion and fear. One note spoke of being unable to imagine life if her husband ever left her. Another hinted that she had once tried to find a way out when she thought their relationship might end. Handwriting experts confirmed they were hers, written weeks before the fire. These writings reveal that long before she reached Seven Falls, Christina was already in distress. At the same time, the environment around her offered every condition for tragedy. The cottage stood in near isolation, reachable only by boat. The third person in the party, Ronald Barry, spent parts of the final day away from the property. That left Christina with time, privacy, and a sense of finality. Medical reports later showed traces of a sedative in both Christina and her husband Jack, enough to leave him semi-conscious when rescuers found him. Doctors described his state as stuporous, his memory blank after late morning. If Christina administered or encouraged the use of that medication, it may have been to quiet the chaos around her, or to prevent interruption. Either way, the result was the same. Jack could not recall what happened next. Sometime around midday, the cottage erupted in flames. Witnesses on the river saw smoke rising, but no people outside. Barry returned by boat to find the building fully alight and Jack barely responsive. He pulled him to safety and ferried him toward town. When the smoke cleared hours later, locals combed the shoreline. In a shallow offshoot of the river, only a short walk from the ruins, they found Christina. The medical examiner determined she had succumbed to the elements, not to injury or fire. There were no wounds, no sign of restraint, and no struggle of any kind. The location of her body, peaceful, deliberate, only steps from the burned cabin, is one of the clearest indicators of what took place. Major Lawrence Scarterfield, a neighbor who had drawn water from that exact spot earlier, testified that he saw nothing there at the time. This means Christina must have moved there later, unseen. If she had been escaping the fire, instinct should have driven her toward help or deeper water where a boat could reach her. Instead, she ended up somewhere still, alone and quiet. That decision pattern suggests intention, not accident. The final letter she wrote adds weight. Handed to Barry before he left, it included a single unsettling line. By the time he gets back, everything will be all over with. No one knew what she meant until the following day. The phrase reads today as both a warning and a farewell. When investigators tried to force this evidence into a murder narrative, it refused to fit. To accept a plot, one must believe that two or perhaps one individual staged an elaborate death with perfect precision, poisoning without traces of violence, creating a fire that destroyed all evidence but no witnesses, and gaining no financial reward. The insurance policies so often cited never paid out. The men accused of conspiracy walked away with nothing but suspicion. If greed or hatred drove them, the plan yielded no benefit at all. The emotional explanation, however, requires no such gymnastics. Christina's state of mind was already documented. The scene at Seven Falls aligns with it, and even the odd details, the fire, the drug, the isolation, follow a single through line. A woman who felt cornered by her own life and saw no safe way forward. This reading also matches the legal outcome. The jury returned what's called an open verdict, acknowledging that her passing was suspicious, but offering no charge of crime. In practice, that verdict often signals that investigators lean toward personal cause, but cannot state it outright. In 1947, the language for emotional illness was almost non-existent, and the stigma surrounding such cases immense. Declaring a young bride's death self-inflicted would have been socially unthinkable. The open verdict gave everyone a way to close the file without assigning blame. The scenario of a desperate internal collapse explains more and assumes less than any murder theory. It accounts for the letters, the sedative, the absence of struggle, and the lack of financial gain. It even explains why both men remained free. There was simply no evidence that anyone harmed her. That does not absolve them entirely. Jack's emotional distance and Ronald's intrusive loyalty may have deepened Christina's turmoil. Neither man seems to have recognized how fragile she had become. But there is a difference between negligence and intent, between failing to see a cry for help and orchestrating a death. What most likely happened is that Christina's final days spiraled under the weight of fear, love, and confusion. In a moment of exhaustion, she made a private choice that ended her life and forever altered theirs. The fire was her closing act, a way to erase what she couldn't face, and the river became the silence that followed. Decades later, the unanswered questions linger. Did she truly mean to go through with it, or did the chaos simply overwhelm her? We can't know. What remains certain is that Christina's story reflects not a perfect crime, but an imperfect understanding of mental struggle, of isolation, and of the quiet signals people send before everything stops. If this theory feels unsatisfying, it's because real tragedies rarely end with villains. They end with people who needed help and didn't receive it. In the case of the 8-Day Bride, the mystery may never fade, but the simplest answer has been visible all along, written in her own hand, waiting to be read.